Hi, mystery writers. Well, today we're going to talk about the detective in the victim's world. This is the major setup for your mystery story, and it's a lot of fun. It's setting up how your detective goes about beginning their investigation. So, as you take your detective and your readers deeper into the story and that first half of your book, your detective enters a new world, and it's the victim's world. Um, as that detective wanders the victim's world, he gathers bits and pieces of information, meets suspects, and in their environment, which is the victim's environment, your detective expands their vision of the victim's world. And of course, this helps the reader understand that victim's world. In this sequence of chapters, your detective searches and searches. And she thinks she knows the victim's world and then discovers there's more than her first introduction. And with each discovery, your detective goes deeper into the world until he makes a discovery that turns everything around, which is going to be your midpoint. So you want to pay close attention to this section of your story. It's a big section, it's like the first half after the inciting incident up to the midpoint. Um, and this is where many new novelists start sagging. You've heard about the sagging middle. Well, it can start as early as this. So the first thing you want to do is avoid rushing to the end. The end is a long way away. So you're going to, I like to think of it as going from major plot point to major plot point. So if we start from the inciting incident when the detective takes on the case for whatever reason, whatever, however your story is set up, um, you want to dive deep, deep, deep into the victim's world. And this is where you set up all your clues, you set up your red herrings. This is where your detective does their detecting, I guess you could call it. So, um, after that inciting incident, let's just go through it step by step here. After the inciting incident, your detective takes a step back and then follows a first clue or interviews the first suspect. So they're like plunging in, they're starting their investigation. Your detective gets new information, and right here you can plant a clue, but it's a clue that your detective misses this first time around. You plant the clue, but your detective just slips on by that clue. And now that they're beginning their investigation, your detective has some kind of a plan. He has no idea that he's overlooked something important, like a snippet of dialogue that was false. And just to make things worse, his opponent throws a wrench in the works. And just to backtrack, the opponent is different than the antagonist. The antagonist is the villain, the one who committed the crime. And the opponent is someone who is opposed to your detective's success. Um, so, for instance, in law enforcement, detective mystery, it could be somebody else who is jealous or somebody higher up who wants to keep pushing them down. It just depends. Um, so, so you can add that complication. Your detective's starting to go, and now the opponent comes in, bammo. Okay. Um, and you have that obstacle. And then your detective starts working on the plan they created. but the plan doesn't work. Uh, a rival or a superior who wants things may deter him to get and wants them to work their way, not your detective's way. Um, and and if you're into plot structure, this is the first complication. Detective sets out on the course, and all of a sudden, oops, something happens, and it gets a little more complicated. Um, So then your detective looks at their original plan to see if he can spot the error that he's conscious that he or she. Uh, a suspect or a new suspect gives him a new piece of information that seems like good advice or a new insight into the victim. And here is another place where you can add a subplot. The detective meets a member of the opposite sex who is some combination of intriguing, sexy, smart, and so unlike your detective that as attractive as they are, it's not going to work. But still, you know, so you get to play around with adding dimension and adding various elements to your detective as they're going along trying to solve this puzzle. Um, and then your detective latches onto a clue. Ta-da! They found something. And it's the clue or a suspect, and your detective thinks they have the answer. He or she may even take a risk to prove his point. I'm right. I got it. Instead, the mystery becomes more mysterious. And to add insult to injury, the detective um, opponent wins a triumph. So you get to weave your subplots in with your detective going along. And the thing is that with all this stuff going on, your detective really isn't learning a lot about the victim. All right. And it's understanding the victim's world and how that victim works in that world that's going to help your detective eventually solve this case. But right now, you're setting up all the complications. This is a real setup for the rest of your story. So your detective blunders along on her discovery path and even makes a find that seems to lead her closer to the killer. But everything, especially this new discovery, is not exactly what it seems. And that step forward actually sets your detective back. Um, and for plot aficionados, this is the setup for the first plot point, which is um, right around the middle of that section that works up to the midpoint of your story. So I hope this is helping. I'm just kind of walking you through what you can do step by step by step as we go through the first half of the story. So for all your detectives' choices so far, all your detectives' choices have led down a false path. And people around your detective, even their friends, seem to get in his way. He pulls back, takes a look, examines his previous actions, and starts down a new path. And you're probably familiar with this scene in mystery stories where the detective sits back and kind of reviews what they know so far, looks at the clues they've discovered, and examines what suspects have said. And so now this is that first plot point. Because he's going to start down a new path. And this is, if you're following the 4-act structure, this is the beginning of Act 2. We're finishing Act 1, and now we're getting into Act Two and really digging into that victim's world. Your detective stumbles, the plan she devised doesn't fit the circumstances, a new problem or danger upsets the plan, and she feels stumped for the moment. And the pivot she just took slammed her into a wall. She thought she got this clue, she thought she got it all down, and boom, it's not working. So a part of working with your characters is just giving them a lot of trouble. So here we go. We're heading into trouble for your protagonist. And then your detective finds an unexpected ally that tells him more about the victim's world. Now it's going to get like a whole new insight into that victim's world and the victim, and he starts to understand the complications of taking on this murder investigation. This could be the enticing new love interest or a new character like a suspect. Um, and and this is also a good place to kind of reintroduce that love interest if you happen to have that in your story. This is the second complication if you're into plot structure. And then, armed with this new understanding, your detective explores this new knowledge. It's just got a whole bunch of information about the victim and the victim's world and how they operated. And so your detective starts to explore this new knowledge and connect clues and suspects with his new understanding. He's got a whole new viewpoint on what was going on in that victim's world. And meanwhile, that opponent is challenging his moves, not knowing what the detective knows. Um, but back in stride, your detective follows those clues, successfully interviews suspects, and gets a better picture of the victim's world and how they moved into the world. And this is helping your readers understand the victim and the victim's world. And now your detective is starting to get the lay of the land. They're starting to really understand the victim and how they led their life and who was in their life. Um, and really gets a, a better picture of how that operates. And so now your detective discovers there's more to that murder than they first thought. There's a discovery. It's a clue. It's evidence. It's a suspect's new information. Something reveals a whole new perspective on the murder victim and opens up possibilities that your detective hasn't seen before. It's just like, whoa, shift, focus, whoa. Now there's a whole new set of information. And the thing that happens to complicate your story is your detective kind of feels out of their depth. This isn't their area of expertise, and they're baffled or knocked off center. And this is the first pinch point. Um, this is where it gets complicated, and everything your detective has done so far doesn't seem to fit in the overall picture as far as your detective is concerned. And so they feel that they're not making progress, or they've even had a setback. Big setback is going to come at the midpoint, but even now there's like everything is not fitting together. So first they thought with this new information that this was shedding light on everything, and now nope, turns out that not the case. Um, it's just not interpreted the way they want it to be. I hope this is helping you um, because there's a lot that goes into this whole first half of your mystery story, and you get to play around with it. So take your time, do those clues, do that suspect information, baffle your detective, make the new information not make sense. You get to play with this a lot. So you're now, uh, we're kind of heading toward the midpoint, and your detective retreats to review what they know so far, but he's not progressing. So this is the scene you see it a lot, where they talk to somebody. We know this, we know this, we know this. So and so said that, but it's not making any sense. Okay. Um, your detective can be licking their wounds from something his opponent did that keeps him from moving forward. Someone, either a suspect, a love interest, or even his opponent, tells him something, but he overlooks the information. So we're still in setup mode here, right? There's something, and it's important. But right now, because of all this befuddlement, your detective kind of overlooks it. So, oh my gosh, it's not working. It's just not working at all. So, lost in the victim's world, your detective tries one of their tried and true methods, but no one is responding. And she's so frustrated. She's a breath away from throwing in the towel. And desperate, she tries something she's never tried, but maybe it'll work in the victim's world, because now the detective is in this new world, and so they can try new things. Then in walks a love interest, and things get open or even more intimate, and things are mixing up in the plot world as you get to the third complication, because all these things are happening at once. Your detective's trying to focus on solving the puzzle, and then all these things coming from the inside, and the information that they had doesn't make sense. It's all just kind of overwhelming for your detective. And then something unexpected happens, and your detective, boom, is on it. Um, he'll pay a price later. His opponent keeps him from taking the next step, or a suspect shows him in spades that he doesn't understand the victim's world at all. And this is one big complication for your detective. And as far as your detective is concerned, from out of left field, this is my left hand, a surprise that spills all the puzzle pieces. So everything that the detective thought was fitting together about that victim's world is upended. It's like all the puzzle pieces just fly into the air, and forced to improvise, he sees everything in a new light. And now we're heading right for the midpoint. This is the setup for the midpoint. So past that catastrophe, whatever it is, your detective rearranges the puzzle pieces. He sees something new, has an epiphany that tells him he's been looking at the wrong details. It could be that the suspect, who seemed like the right one, reveals an alibi that puts them out of the picture. Whatever it is, he's still lost in that victim's world. And as far as your detective's concerned, um, we're heading toward that midpoint. While your detective rearranges the puzzle pieces, he has that epiphany, and whatever it is, he's still lost in the victim world, and realizes he's been looking at the wrong clues. Okay, so that we've reached the midpoint of your story. So there's been a lot going on, a lot of discovery, a lot of misinformation, a lot of looking at things in the wrong way. So you're still setting up for what happens after the midpoint. So if you think of this first half of your mystery as Set up, set up, set up, set up. Um, you have a lot to play with. So you can keep this section rich, keep from, avoid that sagging middle. Um, and the middle is the pivot where your detective goes from digging deeper into that victim's world. And they go from digging deeper to getting closer to the killer. So the second half of your mystery is going to be narrowing down, while this first half you want to add information and add information, add new suspects, add new information, because your detective's going to have to sort through all of this in the second half of your story. And your detective has gone from discovery to going on the trail, as it were. They're on the path of solving the puzzle, and he's learned enough to hunt for the killer and has possibly some idea of who that could be, although they could be missing important clues or overlooking important clues. And the middle chapter is high drama and pulls your reader deeper into the story. One way to focus this chapter is to make it either a mirror of the end or an opposite of the end. And whether your detective has a complete fail or a win at this point, your detective suddenly sees the victim's world in a new way. This is where the big insight comes. You can make this really high drama. You don't have to save all the drama for the end. So the middle is one of the most important sequences in your detective story. So spend some time honing every detail while shining a light on your detective's skills, right? Your detective's been lost in the forest and can't see it for the trees because there's all this information and all these suspects are telling him different things. And meanwhile, there's opponents trying to keep your detective from getting information or progressing. Um, and all of a sudden, now at the middle, he has a glimpse of the forest. Okay, I hope that helps. Kind of a step-by-step walkthrough of of how your detective goes in the first half of your novel. You're going to discover the victim's world. I think one of the best ways to see how this works is to watch any episode of Midsummer Murders, because because they're also focused on the victim's world. You know, it could be rowing club or horse racing or dog breeding, very, particular victim's world, and how that detective goes into the victim's world, meets the people who surrounded the victim when they were alive, and learns about that victim's interaction with those people. So that's what you're going to do in the first half of your novel, after the inciting incident when the detective takes on the case. All right, I'd love to hear your comments about this, and I hope that helps. It helps you broaden the scope and keep your first part of your middle from sagging. So your reader keeps turning pages because, yeah, just like the detective, they want to know what clues are important and what suspects are giving good information and what suspects are hiding information, so it all works. All right, so thank you very much for being here. Uh, I'm open to questions, so ask them in the comments, and I will see you next time. Keep writing.